Cathryn Ross, in 2014, as the chief executive of the water regulator, you signed off the business plans for the water companies, didn't you?
I did.
And you just said that at that time you thought it was okay for those companies to increase their debt because it was their risk. Is that right?
Yep.
What would have happened at that time if any of the water companies went bankrupt?
Oh gosh, right. So let's just take a step back.
And if you could ask my question, if a company during the time when you were CEO went bust, what would have happened?
Yeah. So what would have happened in the event of a bankruptcy or an insolvency is that the special administration regime that's set out in the legislative framework would kick in. That is a decision for the Secretary of State. I mean, when I was at Ofwat, our expectation would have been that we would advise on that, but it would have been a decision, as I think it still is, for the Secretary of State.
In plain English, that means that it would have had to be nationalised and taxpayers would have had to pick up the bill. That's right, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Well, a special administrative regime, either you sell the business to someone else as a going concern, as we've seen in the failure of the energy market, or the government has to pick up the bill, as it had to do with bulb energy. So ultimately, the taxpayer would have been on the hook, wouldn't they?
Well, in the event that the company couldn't be sold as a going concern, yes, there would be some liabilities that would have to be met, and they could be met by the taxpayer, or they could be passed on to future customers, depending on the regulatory regime at the time.
Right. We're here today because Thames Water, which you now run, is in a position where the government is having to plan to renationalise you because of a failure of your finances. But you signed off as the chief executive of the regulator in 2014 for Macquarie to ramp up the debt from £3 billion to £10 billion, whilst taking out nearly £3 billion in dividends, often paying dividends higher than the profits the company made in particular years. The reason we're in this position, and the reason that taxpayers are now potentially on the hook for billions and billions of pounds of national borrowing, is because you, as the chief executive of the regulator, and the regulator failed in delivering your statutory duties. Do you want to apologise to the public, Ms. Ross?
Well, I don't accept that characterisation of Ofwat's price control in 2014. The other thing I would say as well is special administration is obviously a matter for the government, but special administration is very much a nuclear option. There is a very, very high bar on the government deciding to put a company into special administration. And one of those triggers would be insolvency, and the other one would be, perhaps a persistent and severe breach of our licence. Now, we are not close to either of those two triggers, and you heard our CFO talking a little while ago about the fact that we have £4.4 billion of liquidity. We are a long way off that insolvency trigger, and I think a long way off the conditions for special administration being met.
Ms. Ross, let me ask the question in a different way. Two of the statutory obligations of Ofwat, the water regulator, when it was set up, was one, to protect the interests of customers, and two, to make sure the privatised water companies could finance themselves. On both of those measures, are you seriously telling the committee today that you, as the chief executive of the regulator at the time, succeeded in delivering those statutory obligations in the context that you're before the committee today? Are you really saying that was a success?
I think at the time, when I was at Ofwat, and I believe it to be true today, everybody at Ofwat takes their statutory duties incredibly seriously.
What, did you perform them?
Well, we were exercising our functions in pursuit of our statutory duties. Whether every decision we made was perfect with the benefit of hindsight, possibly not, but that's exactly what we were trying to do.
With the benefit of hindsight, would you like to apologise to the taxpayer for being here and potentially putting them in this position where, yet again, another regulated market could potentially collapse and expose taxpayers to billions of pounds?
I think if you're asking for an apology from Ofwat, I think you should...
Asking for an apology from you, Ms. Ross?
No, I won't apologise for my role as the chief executive at Ofwat, no.